When my husband walked out of the emergency room while I was in active labor, leaving me alone to deliver our daughter, he thought I would always be too weak to fight back. The look on his face when my attorneys served him divorce papers and custody documents 6 months later told me everything I needed to know about how wrong he had been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Castellanos, and until 18 months ago, I believed that love meant accepting whatever scraps of attention and care someone was willing to give you. I had spent 8 years of my life married to a man who treated my needs as optional suggestions, and my feelings as inconvenient interruptions to his carefully planned existence. But sometimes it takes a moment of absolute abandonment to discover the strength you never knew you possessed. The story I am about to share with you changed everything I thought I knew about my own worth, my capacity for resilience, and what it truly means to fight for the life you deserve. If you have ever felt invisible in your own relationship, if you have ever wondered whether you were asking for too much by simply wanting to be treated with basic human decency, if you have ever found yourself making excuses for someone else's inexcusable behavior, then this story is for you. Before I tell you about the night that shattered my world and ultimately rebuilt it stronger than ever, I need you to understand who I was before that moment. Understanding my journey requires knowing how I arrived at that emergency room, 8 months pregnant and married to a man who would choose a business dinner over the birth of his child. I met James Whitmore during my final year of graduate school at Northwestern University. I was completing my master's degree in educational psychology, passionate about helping children overcome learning difficulties and unlock their potential. James was finishing his MBA, already focused on climbing the corporate ladder at his father's commercial real estate firm. He was everything my practical mind told me I should want: ambitious, financially stable, from a well-established family, and possessing the kind of confident charisma that made other people take notice when he entered a room. Our courtship followed a predictable pattern that I mistook for romantic stability. James planned our dates with military precision, always choosing upscale restaurants where he could network with potential business contacts. He introduced me to his family at carefully orchestrated events, where I was expected to smile politely and demonstrate that I would be an appropriate addition to their social circle. His mother, Victoria Whitmore, evaluated my appearance, my conversation skills, and my family background with the thoroughness of someone conducting a job interview. I passed their assessments, not because they saw my individual worth, but because I fit their predetermined criteria for what James needed in a wife. I had an advanced degree, but not in a field that would compete with his career ambitions. I came from a middle-class family that was respectable but not threatening to their established social position. I was attractive enough to reflect well on James at company functions, but not so striking that I would overshadow him or attract unwanted attention from his colleagues. During our engagement, I convinced myself that James's methodical approach to our relationship demonstrated his commitment to building something lasting. When he scheduled our wedding planning meetings like business appointments and created spreadsheets to track our guest list and budget allocation, I told myself he was being responsible and thorough. When he dismissed my preferences for our ceremony in favor of what would look best to his professional network, I rationalized that he understood the business world better than I did and was making decisions that would benefit our future together. The warning signs were there from the beginning, but I had trained myself to reinterpret them as evidence of his dedication rather than indications of his fundamental selfishness. When James canceled 3 different romantic weekend trips because of work emergencies that could have been handled by someone else, I praised his work ethic. When he forgot my birthday because he was preparing for a major presentation, I told myself that his career success would ultimately benefit both of us. When he consistently arrived late to events that mattered to me while never missing anything related to his professional obligations, I made excuses about the demanding nature of his industry. Looking back now, I can see that I was already making myself smaller to accommodate his needs, already accepting a relationship where my feelings and priorities were consistently treated as secondary to his ambitions. But at the time, I believed I was being a supportive partner, the kind of woman who understood that building a successful life required sacrifices and compromises. Our wedding was a flawless production that showcased James's attention to detail and his family's social connections. 250 guests attended a ceremony at the exclusive Fairmont Hotel, where every element from the floral arrangements to the menu selection had been chosen to reflect well on the Whitmore family reputation. I felt beautiful in my designer gown, surrounded by elegant decorations and celebrating with people who seemed genuinely happy for our future together. What I failed to recognize was that the entire event had been planned around everyone's needs except mine. The ceremony time had been selected to accommodate James's business partner's travel schedule. The reception venue had been chosen because Victoria Whitmore served on their charity board. The guest list had been curated to include James's professional contacts and his family's social circle, while my own friends and extended family had been relegated to a smaller section of the room. Even our honeymoon reflected James's priorities, rather than our shared interests. Instead of the cultural tour of Italy that I had suggested, we spent a week at a luxury resort in the Bahamas, where James could play golf with other business executives, while their wives lounged by the pool discussing interior decorating and charity fundraising events. I spent most of the trip reading alone on the beach, already beginning to understand that my role in this marriage would be to provide an attractive and agreeable backdrop to James's ambitions, rather than to participate as an equal partner in building our life together. The first few years of our marriage established patterns that would define our relationship until its ultimate dissolution. James threw himself into his career with single-minded determination, working 12-hour days and traveling frequently for business development meetings. I focused on establishing my own practice as an educational consultant, working with families whose children struggled with learning disabilities and academic confidence issues. My work was deeply fulfilling, allowing me to combine my professional training with my natural empathy to help young people overcome obstacles and discover their own capabilities. I specialized in working with children who had been labeled as difficult or unsuccessful by traditional educational systems, helping them develop strategies and confidence that transformed their academic performance and self-perception. James viewed my career as a pleasant hobby that provided me with something to occupy my time while he focused on building real financial success. He never asked about my clients or showed interest in the breakthroughs I achieved with struggling students. When I shared stories about particularly rewarding cases, he would listen with polite attention before changing the subject to his own professional achievements or challenges. His dismissive attitude toward my work reflected a broader pattern of minimizing anything that did not directly contribute to his own goals and image. My interests, my friendships, my family relationships, and my personal needs were all evaluated based on how they affected his comfort and convenience, rather than being valued for their importance to me as an individual. When I expressed frustration about feeling disconnected from him or lonely in our marriage, James would respond with logical explanations about the temporary nature of his demanding schedule and the long-term benefits of his current sacrifice. He would remind me of the beautiful house we lived in, the luxury vacations we took, and the social status we enjoyed as evidence that his priorities were correct and my complaints were unreasonable. I learned to stop voicing my dissatisfaction because James had perfected the art of making me feel selfish and unrealistic for wanting more emotional connection and partnership in our relationship. He never raised his voice or said anything overtly cruel, but he had developed sophisticated techniques for making me question my own perceptions and needs. When I suggested that we spend more time together without work distractions, James would point out how much money he was sacrificing by taking time away from potential business opportunities. When I asked him to be more present during the limited time we did spend together, he would explain how mentally exhausting his responsibilities were and how unreasonable it was for me to expect him to be entertaining after working so hard to provide for our lifestyle. The most insidious aspect of his emotional manipulation was his ability to make me feel grateful for the minimal attention and affection he did provide. When James remembered to bring me flowers after a particularly long business trip, I would be so relieved by this gesture of thoughtfulness that I would forget about the weeks of feeling ignored and unimportant. When he agreed to attend a family gathering or social event that mattered to me, I would focus on appreciating his presence rather than questioning why such occasions required negotiation and persuasion, rather than being automatic expressions of his love and support. By our 5th year of marriage, I had unconsciously trained myself to expect very little from our relationship and to be grateful for whatever crumbs of attention James was willing to offer. I had stopped planning activities that required his participation, because I was tired of being disappointed when he canceled or attended with obvious reluctance. I had stopped sharing my deeper thoughts and feelings because he had made it clear that emotional conversations were inconvenient and unnecessary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had become a supporting character in my own life, existing primarily to provide James with the appearance of a stable marriage, while making minimal demands on his time, energy, or emotional availability. I convinced myself that this was what mature love looked like, that expecting passion and genuine partnership was naive and unrealistic for people with serious professional responsibilities. The irony was that during this same period, my work with struggling students was teaching me daily about the importance of believing in someone's potential and providing them with the support and encouragement they needed to thrive. I was helping children discover their own strength and capability while simultaneously accepting a marriage where my own worth was consistently diminished and my potential for happiness was treated as irrelevant. I had become an expert at recognizing when young people were being held back by low expectations and insufficient support, yet I was blind to how completely I had accepted similar treatment in my most important personal relationship. I was passionate about helping children develop the confidence to advocate for themselves and pursue their dreams, while I had quietly abandoned my own needs and desires to avoid conflict with a man who viewed my happiness as optional. The contrast between who I was professionally and who I had become personally should have been a wake-up call, but I had become so skilled at compartmentalizing my life that I failed to apply the insights from my successful career to my failing marriage. I could see clearly when children were being undervalued and neglected, but I had lost the ability to recognize that I deserved the same care and respect that I encouraged my young clients to demand for themselves. This was the version of myself that became pregnant after 7 years of marriage, during a brief period when James seemed more attentive and affectionate than usual. I later realized that his temporary increase in attention had coincided with a major business deal that required him to present himself as a stable family man to potential investors, but at the time I interpreted his behavior as evidence that our relationship was finally deepening and maturing. When I discovered I was pregnant, I felt a combination of joy and terror that surprised me with its intensity. I had always wanted children, but I had begun to doubt whether James would ever be ready to shift his priorities enough to make space for family life. The pregnancy represented both the fulfillment of my deepest desires and a test of whether my marriage could evolve beyond the superficial partnership it had become. James's initial response to the pregnancy news seemed positive, though characteristically focused on practical considerations rather than emotional connection. He immediately began researching the best obstetricians, the highest-rated hospitals, and the most exclusive private schools, approaching impending fatherhood with the same methodical planning he applied to business projects. I mistook his practical engagement for emotional investment, not yet understanding that James viewed our baby primarily as another element of his carefully curated image rather than as a person he was eager to love and nurture. He was excited about becoming a father in the abstract sense, proud of adding this achievement to his list of life accomplishments, but he showed little interest in the day-to-day reality of pregnancy, or the emotional journey we were supposed to be sharing. As my pregnancy progressed, the fundamental problems in our marriage became more apparent rather than less. James continued to prioritize work above everything else, missing prenatal appointments, avoiding conversations about parenting responsibilities, and showing irritation when pregnancy-related needs interfered with his schedule or plans. The night that changed everything began like so many others, with James announcing that he had an important business dinner that could not be rescheduled, despite the fact that I was already experiencing irregular contractions and had been feeling unwell throughout the day. At 38 weeks pregnant, I was officially considered full-term, and my doctor had warned me that labor could begin at any time. When I asked James to postpone his dinner, or at least ensure that his phone would be available if I needed him, he responded with the familiar mixture of logic and dismissal that had characterized our entire relationship. The dinner was with potential investors, who were only in town for one night. The meeting could determine the success or failure of his most important business deal. I was probably just experiencing false labor, and even if it was real labor, first babies typically took many hours to arrive. I should have insisted that he stay home. I should have demanded that my needs and our baby's arrival take precedence over his business obligations. But 8 years of training had taught me to accept his priorities as more important than my own, to believe that my concerns were probably overblown, and to avoid creating conflict that might interfere with his professional success. So I told him to go to his dinner, promising to call if anything significant happened, secretly hoping that he would recognize the inappropriateness of his choice and decide to stay with me. Instead, he kissed my forehead distractedly, reminded me that his phone might be on silent during the dinner, and left me alone in our beautiful house with an emergency bag packed, and a growing certainty that this night would end differently than either of us expected. What happened next would shatter every assumption I had made about my marriage, my worth, and my capacity to survive on my own. But it would also mark the beginning of the most important transformation of my life, the moment when I finally stopped accepting less than I deserved and started fighting for the future I wanted to create. If you have ever felt alone in a relationship that was supposed to provide partnership and support, if you have ever wondered whether you were asking for too much by expecting basic consideration and care, if you have ever made excuses for someone else's inexcusable choices, then you understand the version of myself that went into labor that October night, still believing that love meant accepting whatever someone else was willing to give you. You are about to discover, along with James Whitmore and everyone else who underestimated me, just how wrong that assumption turned out to be. The contractions began in earnest at 9:47 p.m., exactly 37 minutes after James left for his business dinner. I know the precise time because I was standing in our kitchen, holding a glass of water and watching the digital clock on the microwave, when the first wave of real pain seized my entire abdomen with an intensity that made my previous discomfort seem like a gentle warning. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced during the weeks of false labor that had been teasing me for the past month. This pain demanded my complete attention, radiating from my lower back through my pelvis, with a purposeful rhythm that my body seemed to recognize even though my mind was still catching up to the reality of what was happening. I set the water glass on the counter with trembling hands and began timing the intervals, hoping desperately that this was another false alarm, even as some deeper instinct told me that our daughter had decided tonight was the night she would make her entrance into the world. By 10:15 p.m., the contractions were coming every 6 minutes with a consistency that left no room for denial. I called James's cell phone, knowing it would likely go to voicemail but needing to try anyway. His recorded voice, professional and distant even in this personal context, invited me to leave a message that he would return as soon as possible. I tried to keep my voice calm and matter-of-fact as I explained that I was experiencing regular contractions and would need him to come home soon, but even as I spoke the words, I could hear the underlying plea that I was trying so hard to suppress. The next hour passed in a blur of escalating pain and growing anxiety, as I tried repeatedly to reach James while managing contractions that were becoming stronger and more frequent with each passing cycle. I called his office line, knowing he wouldn't be there but hoping his assistant might have information about where the dinner was taking place. I tried texting him urgent messages that went unread and unanswered. I even attempted to reach his business partner, Marcus, but his phone also went directly to voicemail. As the pain intensified and the intervals between contractions shortened to 4 minutes, then 3, I realized I was facing a choice that no woman should have to make while in active labor. I could wait for James to check his phone and risk delivering our baby alone in our house, or I could drive myself to the hospital and hope that he would join me there once he finally received my messages. The decision was made for me when a particularly powerful contraction caused me to double over in our hallway, gripping the wall for support while a flood of warm liquid ran down my legs onto the hardwood floor. My water had broken, and there was no longer any question about whether this was real labor or how much time I had before our daughter would arrive. I managed to call an ambulance, though speaking clearly through the contractions required every ounce of concentration I possessed. The dispatcher was professional and reassuring, asking me standard questions about my due date, previous pregnancies, and current symptoms, while I struggled to provide coherent answers between waves of pain. She stayed on the line with me until the paramedics arrived, offering calming words and practical advice that helped me maintain some sense of control during what felt like the complete breakdown of my carefully planned birthing experience. The paramedics who responded to my call were competent and compassionate, immediately recognizing that I was in advanced labor and needed immediate transport to the hospital. They helped me gather my overnight bag and important documents, while efficiently preparing me for the ambulance ride, treating me with the kind of professional care and attention that James should have been providing but was nowhere to be found. During the 10-minute ride to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, I continued trying to reach James while managing contractions that were now coming every 2 minutes with increasing intensity. The paramedic monitoring my vital signs was a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who had clearly delivered many babies during her career. She held my hand during the worst contractions and assured me that everything was progressing normally, even though I was obviously in distress about being alone during such an important moment. "Honey, sometimes babies don't wait for anyone's schedule," Patricia said gently as she checked my blood pressure between contractions. "Your little girl is ready to meet you, and that's what matters most right now. Is there someone else we can call to be with you?" I realized with a shock of recognition that I couldn't think of anyone else to call. During 8 years of marriage, I had gradually lost touch with most of my close friends, partly due to James's subtle discouragement of relationships that didn't serve his social or professional interests, and partly because I had become so focused on trying to be the perfect wife that I had neglected the friendships that once sustained me. My sister lived in California and was dealing with her own family crisis. My parents were traveling in Europe for their 40th wedding anniversary, a trip they had been planning for years. My closest college friend had moved to Boston for a job opportunity, and we had let our communication dwindle to occasional social media interactions and holiday cards. The isolation that I had accepted as a natural consequence of adult responsibilities suddenly revealed itself as something much more troubling, a systematic erosion of my support network that had left me completely dependent on a man who wasn't even answering his phone while I gave birth to his child. We arrived at the hospital emergency room at 11:43 p.m., and I was immediately transferred to a wheelchair and rushed to the maternity ward, where the staff took over my care with efficiency and expertise. The triage nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands, quickly assessed my condition and determined that I was already 7 centimeters dilated and progressing rapidly toward delivery. "This baby is in a hurry," she announced to the team assembling around my bed. "We need to get her upstairs and ready for delivery immediately. Is Dad on his way?" Quote, I tried to explain that my husband was at a business dinner and hadn't responded to my calls yet, but another contraction seized me before I could finish the sentence. The nurse squeezed my shoulder sympathetically and assured me that they would take excellent care of me whether he arrived in time or not. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of medical procedures, mounting pain, and the surreal experience of going through labor without the partner who was supposed to be my primary source of support and encouragement. The nursing staff was exceptional, providing both medical expertise and emotional comfort as I navigated the most challenging physical experience of my life while dealing with the emotional trauma of my husband's absence. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the attending obstetrician who took over my care, was a woman in her early 40s who radiated competence and compassion. She explained each stage of my labor clearly and involved me in all decisions about my care, treating me as an intelligent partner in the birthing process rather than a passive patient who needed to be managed by medical professionals. "Elena, you're doing beautifully," Dr. Martinez said as she checked my progress around 2 a.m. "Your baby is in perfect position, and everything is proceeding exactly as it should. I know this isn't how you planned for tonight to go, but you're handling this with incredible strength and grace." Her words meant more to me than she could have known. For years, I had received so little genuine encouragement and recognition from the person whose opinion mattered most to me, that hearing professional acknowledgement of my capabilities felt like a revelation. I was handling this crisis with strength and grace not because someone was supporting me through it, but because I possessed resources and resilience that I had forgotten existed. At 3:17 a.m., James finally arrived at the hospital, bursting into my delivery room with the kind of dramatic urgency that might have been touching if it hadn't come 5.5 hours after I first called him for help. He was still wearing his expensive business suit, though his tie was loosened and his usually perfect hair was disheveled, creating the appearance of someone who had rushed to be by my side. "Elena, sweetheart, I'm so sorry," he began, reaching for my hand with what seemed like genuine remorse. "The dinner ran so much later than expected, and I didn't see your messages until we were leaving the restaurant. I came as soon as I could." His explanation might have been acceptable if I hadn't been coherent enough to notice several details that contradicted his narrative of innocent miscommunication. His breath carried the distinct aroma of expensive whiskey, suggesting that his business dinner had involved significantly more alcohol than a typical professional meeting. His shirt had lipstick stains on the collar that were a shade I had never worn. raising questions about exactly what kind of business had been conducted that evening. Most tellingly, when I asked why he hadn't checked his phone for over 5 hours, he became defensive and irritated rather than apologetic. "Elena, this isn't the time to interrogate me about my evening," James said sharply, his initial show of concern already giving way to his characteristic impatience with anything that challenged his version of events. "I'm here now, and that's what matters. How are you feeling? When is the baby coming?" Dr. Martinez had been observing this interaction with professional discretion, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was forming her own opinions about my husband's priorities and character. When James began asking detailed questions about the medical procedures and trying to take charge of decisions that I had already made with my healthcare team, she politely but firmly established that her patient was me and that my preferences would continue to guide all aspects of my care. The final stage of labor progressed quickly after James's arrival, though his presence felt more like an additional source of stress than the comfort and support I had imagined receiving from my life partner during this momentous occasion. He alternated between hovering anxiously and checking his phone for work messages, never quite managing to be fully present for the experience we were supposed to be sharing. When our daughter finally made her entrance into the world at 4:52 a.m., the moment was so overwhelmingly beautiful and profound that it temporarily overshadowed all my concerns about James's behavior. She was perfect in every way, with dark hair like mine and expressive eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with alert curiosity. Holding her for the first time, feeling her warm weight against my chest and listening to her strong, healthy cries, I experienced a love so immediate and fierce that it changed something fundamental in my understanding of what I was capable of feeling and doing. "She's gorgeous, Elena," James said softly, and for a moment his voice carried genuine emotion and wonder. "Look what we made together." Quote, "For a brief period, as we marveled at our daughter's tiny fingers and perfect features, I allowed myself to believe that this experience might mark a turning point in our marriage. Perhaps becoming parents would help James understand what truly mattered in life. Perhaps the overwhelming reality of holding his own child would shift his priorities and make him recognize that some things were more important than business deals and professional advancement." Those hopes were shattered less than an hour later, when James's phone rang with what he described as an urgent call from his business partner about a problem that had developed with their investor meeting. Without asking if I needed anything, or even discussing whether this was an appropriate time to leave, James announced that he had to go handle a crisis at the office and would return later that morning. "The investors are flying back to New York this afternoon, and if we don't resolve this issue immediately, we could lose the entire deal," he explained while already putting on his suit jacket. "I'll be back as soon as I can, and then we can focus on enjoying our new family." I was exhausted, emotionally overwhelmed, and holding our hours-old daughter when my husband walked out of the hospital room to attend to business matters that he deemed more urgent than staying with his wife and newborn child. The nurse who had been monitoring my recovery looked shocked by his departure, clearly unable to comprehend how any father could prioritize work over these first precious moments with his baby. "Honey, is there someone else we can call to be with you?" she asked gently, the same question Patricia the paramedic had posed hours earlier. New mothers shouldn't be alone during these first few hours after delivery. Once again, I realized that I had no one else to call. No support system beyond the husband who had just demonstrated that even the birth of his child wasn't significant enough to warrant his undivided attention. I had allowed my marriage to become so central to my identity that I had lost the friendships and connections that might have sustained me during this moment of need. The next several hours passed in a strange combination of bliss and heartbreak as I bonded with my daughter while processing the reality of James's abandonment. Every time I looked at her beautiful face or felt her tiny hand grip my finger, I experienced overwhelming joy and love. But underlying that happiness was a growing awareness that the partnership I had expected to share in raising this precious child was already revealing itself to be an illusion. James returned to the hospital later that afternoon with an expensive bouquet of flowers and explanations about how his quick thinking had saved the business deal, expecting praise for his professional competence and gratitude for the financial security his success would provide for our family. He seemed genuinely surprised by my subdued response to his news and hurt by my lack of enthusiasm for his achievements. "Elena, I thought you'd be happy that everything worked out with the investors," he said, settling into the chair beside my hospital bed, with the air of someone who expected appreciation rather than criticism. "This deal is going to set us up financially for the next decade. Our daughter will never have to worry about college tuition or anything else she might need." I looked at him holding our baby, mechanically going through the motions of fatherly affection while clearly thinking about other things, and realized that he genuinely believed his financial contributions were adequate substitutes for emotional presence and genuine partnership. He had convinced himself that providing material security justified his absence from the most important moments of our family's life. "James, I needed you here with me," I said quietly, too exhausted to engage in an argument but too hurt to pretend that his choices were acceptable. Our daughter needed her father to be present for her birth, not handling business calls in the hallway. "I was present for her birth," he replied defensively. "I was here when she was born, and I held her first thing. The business call happened after she arrived, and it only took an hour to resolve. You're being unreasonable about something that was completely unavoidable." His ability to reframe his abandonment as reasonable behavior while characterizing my hurt as unreasonable expectations revealed the depth of his self-deception and the futility of hoping he might recognize how his actions had affected me. James lived in a world where his priorities were automatically correct, and anyone who questioned them was being emotional and irrational. Over the next 2 days in the hospital, this pattern repeated itself constantly. James would arrive with flowers or gifts, spend brief periods holding our daughter and taking photos to share with his business associates, then disappear for hours to handle work emergencies that always seemed to arise at the most inconvenient moments. He missed the pediatrician's first examination, left during the lactation consultant's feeding tutorial, and was absent when the nurses were teaching me essential newborn care techniques. Each absence was accompanied by logical explanations about urgent business matters that couldn't wait, along with assurances that he would make up for lost time once we were home and his work schedule returned to normal. But I was beginning to understand that his work schedule would never return to normal, because James had no intention of allowing fatherhood to interfere with his professional ambitions. The most revealing moment came on our final day in the hospital when James received a call about a potential client dinner that evening, just hours before we were scheduled to take our daughter home for the first time. Without consulting me or acknowledging that this might not be an appropriate time to schedule business entertainment, he accepted the invitation and informed me that he would meet us at home later that night. "Elena, this client has been impossible to pin down for months, and if I don't take this meeting, our competitor will definitely get the contract," he explained while adjusting his tie in the hospital room mirror. "You'll be fine getting home with the baby. It's not that complicated." I stared at him in complete disbelief, holding our 3-day-old daughter and realizing that my husband saw nothing inappropriate about missing our family's homecoming in order to attend a business dinner. In his mind, taking care of a newborn was simple enough that it didn't require both parents, while entertaining potential clients was sophisticated work that demanded his personal attention and expertise. "James, this is our first night home with our daughter," I said, trying one more time to help him understand why his priorities were so hurtful. "Don't you want to be there for this milestone?" "Of course I want to be there," he replied impatiently. "But I also want to provide for our family's future. Someone has to make the hard choices and sacrifices necessary to maintain our lifestyle. You get to stay home and enjoy bonding with the baby while I handle the pressure of supporting all of us financially." His characterization of my role as enjoyable relaxation, while his work constituted noble sacrifice, perfectly encapsulated everything that was wrong with our marriage. James had convinced himself that his professional success was a generous gift he was providing to his ungrateful wife and child, rather than recognizing that his repeated absences during crucial moments were acts of emotional abandonment that were damaging his family's well-being. That evening, as I sat alone in our beautiful house with our newborn daughter, struggling through my first night of solo parenting while my husband entertained clients at an upscale restaurant, I finally began to acknowledge what I had been avoiding for years. This was not a temporary situation that would improve once James adjusted to fatherhood. This was not a communication problem that could be resolved through better expression of my needs and feelings. I was married to a man who fundamentally believed that his career goals were more important than his family responsibilities, who viewed my emotional needs as optional conveniences that could be addressed when convenient for his schedule. No amount of discussion or compromise was going to transform James into the partner and father I had hoped he would become, because he saw nothing wrong with his current approach to our relationship. Sitting in our nursery at 2 a.m., feeding our daughter while James was presumably still discussing quarterly projections over expensive wine, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me just days earlier. I was not going to spend the next 18 years making excuses for a man who had already demonstrated that even the most significant moments in our family's life would always be secondary to his professional ambitions. Our daughter deserved better than a father who treated her existence as a footnote to his business achievements. I deserved better than a husband who viewed my needs as unreasonable interruptions to his important work. And most importantly, I deserved the opportunity to discover who I could become when I stopped accepting less than I was worth and started fighting for the life I wanted to create. The transformation that began that night in the emergency room, when I realized I possessed the strength to handle crisis and change without waiting for someone else's permission or support, was about to reshape everything I thought I knew about my own capabilities and the future I could build for myself and my daughter. James had no idea that his business dinner was the last straw in a marriage that had been deteriorating for years. He had no idea that the woman he left alone with a newborn baby was not the same woman who had spent 8 years accepting his emotional neglect and prioritizing his comfort over her own well-being. He was about to discover that abandoning someone during their most vulnerable moment doesn't make them weaker. Sometimes it makes them strong enough to stop accepting abandonment altogether. The first 6 weeks after our daughter Isabella's birth passed in a surreal combination of new mother exhaustion and growing clarity about the reality of my marriage. While my body recovered from childbirth, and I adjusted to the overwhelming demands of caring for a newborn, my mind was processing everything that had happened during those crucial first days of her life with a sharpness that surprised me. Each sleepless night, as I fed Isabella while James slept undisturbed in our bedroom, I found myself reviewing not just the emergency room abandonment, but years of smaller abandonments that I had rationalized or minimized. The pattern that had revealed itself so starkly during my labor had actually been present throughout our entire relationship, but I had trained myself to focus on James's explanations rather than his actions, his intentions rather than his impact. During those quiet pre-dawn hours, holding my daughter and listening to her gentle breathing, I began to understand that the woman who had accepted years of emotional neglect and who had made excuses for her husband's absence during the birth of their child was not weak or foolish. She had been operating from a belief system that equated love with sacrifice and partnership with accommodation, beliefs that had been reinforced by a culture that praised women for being understanding and flexible, while rarely questioning whether the men in their lives were providing equivalent consideration and care. But becoming a mother had shifted something fundamental in my perspective. Looking at Isabella's perfect, trusting face, I realized that I would never want her to accept the kind of treatment I had been tolerating. I would never want her to believe that love required her to make herself smaller, to suppress her needs, or to be grateful for the minimal effort someone else was willing to invest in her happiness and well-being. The recognition that I was modeling a relationship dynamic that would potentially influence my daughter's future expectations of love and partnership created an urgency about change that had been absent when I was only considering my own needs. Isabella deserved to grow up seeing her mother valued and respected, not dismissed and marginalized. She deserved to learn that healthy relationships required mutual effort and consideration, not one-sided sacrifice and accommodation. James's behavior during those first weeks of fatherhood confirmed every concern I had developed about his capacity for genuine partnership and emotional presence. He approached parenting with the same detached efficiency he applied to business projects, viewing Isabella as another responsibility to be managed rather than a person to be cherished and nurtured. When Isabella cried during the night, James would suggest that I handle the situation, since breastfeeding made me the more logical choice for nighttime care. When she needed diaper changes or baths, he would defer to my maternal instincts while positioning himself as an assistant rather than an equal partner in her care. When friends and family visited to meet our daughter, James would proudly display her like an achievement he had accomplished, while leaving me to manage all the practical aspects of hosting and infant care simultaneously. His contributions to Isabella's daily care were minimal and sporadic, offered more as favors to me than as natural expressions of paternal love and responsibility. When he did participate in feeding or changing her, he approached these tasks with visible reluctance and frequently commented on how difficult and time-consuming they were, creating the impression that he was making significant sacrifices while I was simply fulfilling my natural role as her primary caregiver. The most revealing aspect of James's approach to fatherhood was his complete inability to understand why I might need support beyond his financial contributions. When I expressed exhaustion from managing round-the-clock care while recovering from childbirth, he would remind me that his demanding work schedule was ultimately for our family's benefit. When I mentioned feeling isolated and overwhelmed, he would suggest that I hire help rather than recognizing that what I needed was partnership from him. His solution to every challenge I faced as a new mother involved money rather than his personal involvement, reflecting his deep-seated belief that his role as provider exempted him from meaningful participation in the emotional and practical work of family life. He genuinely believed that earning a substantial income was equivalent to being a good husband and father, regardless of his actual availability and engagement with his wife and child. This dynamic became particularly apparent when I attempted to discuss concerns about Isabella's sleep patterns and feeding schedule with James. As someone who had specialized in child development during my graduate studies, I was naturally attentive to her developmental milestones and behavioral cues. But James treated my observations as neurotic overanalysis rather than valuable insights from an educated and experienced professional. When I shared research about infant sleep safety or nutrition guidelines, James would dismiss my concerns as typical new mother anxiety while positioning himself as the rational voice of common sense. When I suggested that we establish consistent routines that would benefit Isabella's development, he would argue that I was overthinking natural processes that didn't require such detailed planning and attention. His invalidation of my expertise and instincts as a mother was particularly painful because it reflected the same pattern of dismissal that had characterized his response to my professional accomplishments throughout our marriage. James had never genuinely respected my intelligence or capabilities, viewing my advanced degree and successful career as pleasant accessories to my primary role as his supportive wife, rather than as evidence of my competence and value as an individual. The contrast between James's approach to fatherhood and my own dedication to Isabella's well-being highlighted the fundamental incompatibility in our values and priorities. Where I saw parenting as the most important work of my life, requiring my full attention and best efforts, James viewed it as one of many responsibilities that could be managed efficiently without interfering with his primary focus on professional achievement. This disparity became even more pronounced when James began traveling for business again just 3 weeks after Isabella's birth. His first trip, a 4-day conference in Las Vegas that he described as essential for maintaining client relationships, left me alone with a newborn, while I was still recovering physically and emotionally from childbirth. When I expressed concern about managing Isabella's care independently so soon after delivery, James responded with irritation rather than understanding, arguing that millions of women throughout history had raised children without constant help, and that my anxiety about a few days alone was evidence of my inexperience rather than a reasonable request for support during a vulnerable time. His characterization of my needs as weakness rather than legitimate concerns revealed the extent to which he had internalized a worldview that valued stoicism and independence over connection and mutual support. James believed that asking for help demonstrated inadequacy, and he extended this philosophy to our marriage and family life, expecting me to handle whatever challenges arose without requiring additional effort or sacrifice from him. During his absence, I discovered something remarkable about my own capabilities and resilience. Despite my initial anxiety about managing Isabella's care alone, I found that I was not only competent, but actually more relaxed and confident, without James's critical presence and minimal assistance. His periodic interventions in her care had often been more disruptive than helpful, breaking the rhythms and routines I had established while adding stress through his obvious reluctance and inexperience. Caring for Isabella without James's reluctant help allowed me to trust my instincts and develop my own approaches to soothing her, feeding her, and responding to her needs. I realized that his absence eliminated the constant undercurrent of tension I felt when trying to meet his expectations for efficient and quiet baby care, while also attending to Isabella's actual needs for attention and nurturing. The most significant revelation during those 4 days alone was recognizing how much mental and emotional energy I had been expending on managing James's reactions and accommodating his preferences, rather than focusing completely on Isabella's well-being and my own recovery. Without his presence, I could make decisions based purely on what seemed best for my daughter and myself, without considering how those choices might inconvenience or annoy my husband. When James returned from his business trip, he seemed surprised by how well Isabella and I had managed in his absence, commenting on how peaceful and organized everything appeared. Rather than recognizing this as evidence of my competence and capability, he interpreted it as confirmation that his concerns about leaving us alone had been unnecessary, and that future business travel wouldn't require the same level of preparation and anxiety. His response revealed another aspect of his character that I was finally beginning to understand clearly. James was most comfortable when the people around him required his help and validation, but he became threatened and dismissive when they demonstrated independence and self-sufficiency. He preferred to be needed rather than wanted, to be essential rather than appreciated, because this dynamic reinforced his sense of superiority and control. My successful management of Isabella's care during his absence challenged his assumption that I needed his presence and guidance to function effectively as a mother. Rather than celebrating my confidence and capability, he seemed unsettled by evidence that I could thrive without his oversight and minimal assistance. This pattern became even more apparent as I began to rebuild connections with friends and colleagues who had been marginalized during my marriage. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a pediatric psychologist who had been my closest friend in graduate school, reached out after hearing about Isabella's birth to offer congratulations and support. Jennifer and I had lost touch during the early years of my marriage, partly due to geographic distance when she moved to Chicago for her residency, but primarily because James had subtly discouraged our friendship through scheduling conflicts and social obligations that prevented me from maintaining regular contact with her. When Jennifer called to congratulate me on Isabella's birth, our conversation reminded me of the intellectual and emotional connection I had once taken for granted, with people who understood and valued my perspectives and expertise. Talking with her about child development research and parenting approaches felt like returning to a part of myself that had been dormant for years. Jennifer's insights about infant development and her recommendations for resources that might support Isabella's growth were exactly the kind of informed discussion I had hoped to have with James but had never been able to achieve. Her enthusiasm for my observations about Isabella's personality and behavior validated my instincts as a mother while reinforcing my professional knowledge about child psychology and development. Most importantly, Jennifer treated my new role as a mother as an expansion of my identity rather than a replacement for my professional expertise and personal interests. She asked about my plans for returning to work, my thoughts about balancing career and family responsibilities, and my ideas for potentially incorporating my parenting experience into my professional practice with other families. Her questions reminded me that becoming a mother didn't require abandoning my other sources of identity and fulfillment, despite James's apparent assumption that my primary focus should now be domestic management, while he continued pursuing his professional ambitions without any corresponding adjustment to his priorities or schedule. The contrast between Jennifer's supportive curiosity about my future plans and James's complete lack of interest in my post-motherhood goals highlighted another significant problem in our marriage. James had never encouraged my professional development or expressed genuine interest in my career aspirations, viewing my work as a hobby that provided me with something to do, while he focused on building real financial success for our family. As Isabella grew from a newborn into a more alert and responsive infant, I began to envision the kind of childhood I wanted to provide for her, and the kind of example I wanted to set about what it meant to be a strong, capable, and valued woman. The life I imagined for my daughter required me to become someone different from the woman I had been during my marriage, someone who modeled self-respect and insisted on being treated with consideration and care. The decision to consult with a divorce attorney wasn't made impulsively or in response to a single incident of James's selfishness and neglect. It evolved gradually over several weeks, as I recognized that the fundamental problems in our marriage weren't going to be resolved through better communication or couples therapy, because they stemmed from James's core beliefs about relationships, responsibility, and respect. James didn't view our marriage as a partnership between equals requiring mutual effort and consideration. He viewed it as a hierarchy where his needs and priorities automatically took precedence over mine, where his contributions were more valuable than mine, and where my role was to provide support and accommodation while expecting minimal reciprocal care and attention. No amount of discussion or negotiation was going to change his belief system, because he saw nothing wrong with the current dynamic. From his perspective, our marriage was functioning exactly as it should, with each partner fulfilling their appropriate roles and responsibilities according to traditional expectations that positioned him as the primary decision-maker and breadwinner, while I managed domestic affairs and childcare. The realization that James was genuinely satisfied with a relationship structure that left me feeling undervalued and emotionally neglected was perhaps the most liberating recognition of all. It meant that I could stop hoping for changes that would never come and start planning for a future that would provide Isabella and me with the respect and consideration we deserved. I began researching divorce attorneys who specialized in cases involving child custody and property division for professional families. I opened a separate bank account and began transferring small amounts of money each week to establish financial independence. I started documenting James's absence from important family events and his minimal participation in Isabella's daily care. Most importantly, I began to envision a life where my needs and priorities mattered, where my expertise and instincts were valued, and where I could model for Isabella what it looked like to be in relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than convenience and accommodation. The woman who had spent 8 years making excuses for her husband's emotional unavailability and who had accepted his abandonment during the birth of their child was transforming into someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to fight for the life she and her daughter deserved. James had no idea that his pattern of neglect and dismissal had finally awakened something in me that would no longer accept being treated as optional. He was about to discover that the quiet, accommodating wife he had taken for granted possessed strength and determination that he had never bothered to recognize, and that underestimating someone's capacity for change could have consequences he had never considered. The foundation for my new life was being laid during those early weeks of motherhood, not through dramatic confrontations or ultimatums, but through quiet recognition of my own value and methodical preparation for the independence that Isabella and I would need to thrive without the man who had already demonstrated that we were secondary to his other priorities. The decision to contact attorney Catherine Morrison came during Isabella's 10th week of life, following an incident that crystallized my understanding of how fundamentally James viewed our family dynamics. I had been invited to speak at a professional conference about innovative approaches to childhood learning disabilities, an opportunity that represented both personal validation and potential career advancement in my field of educational psychology. The conference organizers had specifically requested my participation based on my previous research and publications, and the speaking engagement would have provided valuable exposure for my consulting practice while allowing me to contribute to important discussions about educational reform. The timing seemed manageable, as the conference was scheduled for a single day when Isabella would be old enough to spend several hours with a babysitter. When I shared this professional opportunity with James, his response revealed the depth of his assumption that my career was now permanently secondary to domestic responsibilities. Rather than expressing pride in my professional recognition or offering to adjust his schedule to support my participation, he immediately began listing reasons why accepting the speaking engagement would be impractical and potentially harmful to Isabella's well-being. James argued that leaving Isabella with a babysitter for an entire day was unnecessarily risky when she was still so young and dependent on breastfeeding. He suggested that the stress of preparation and travel might affect my milk supply and disrupt the feeding schedule we had established. He questioned whether the professional benefits of the conference were worth the potential complications to our family routine. Most tellingly, James positioned his concerns as protective of both Isabella and me, framing his opposition to my professional engagement as evidence of his thoughtful consideration for our family's needs. He presented himself as the rational voice of parental responsibility, while characterizing my interest in maintaining professional connections as potentially selfish prioritization of career advancement over maternal duties. His response demonstrated that James viewed my transformation into a mother as a complete redefinition of my identity and priorities, expecting me to abandon the professional achievements and intellectual interests that had once defined my sense of purpose and self-worth. He had assumed that becoming Isabella's mother would naturally eliminate my desire for external validation and career development, leaving me fulfilled by domestic responsibilities and grateful for his continued financial support. The conversation revealed that James had never truly respected my professional capabilities or understood the significance of my work with children and families. Throughout our marriage, he had tolerated my career as a pleasant distraction that provided me with something interesting to do while he focused on building real financial success, but he had never viewed my professional contributions as genuinely valuable or worthy of serious consideration. His expectation that I would automatically decline the conference invitation without discussion or negotiation reflected his belief that my individual needs and aspirations were now appropriately subordinated to family responsibilities, while his own professional commitments remained sacrosanct and non-negotiable regardless of their impact on our household or parenting duties. The contrast between James's assumptions about my post-motherhood priorities and my actual feelings about maintaining professional engagement was stark and illuminating. Rather than finding fulfillment solely through domestic life, I had discovered that becoming a mother had actually enhanced my understanding of child development and strengthened my commitment to helping families navigate educational challenges. My experience with Isabella had provided practical insights that complemented my academic training, creating opportunities to contribute more effectively to discussions about early childhood development and family dynamics. The conference invitation represented not just professional recognition, but a chance to integrate my personal growth as a mother with my expertise as an educational psychologist. James's inability to understand or support this integration of my maternal and professional identities made clear that he viewed motherhood as a limiting rather than expanding experience, something that should naturally reduce my ambitions and interests rather than providing new perspectives and opportunities for contribution. His response to the conference invitation served as the final confirmation that our fundamental values about partnership, personal growth, and family dynamics were incompatibly different. James believed that having children meant that mothers should willingly sacrifice their individual development for the benefit of family stability, while fathers continued pursuing their professional goals with the understanding that their career success ultimately benefited the entire family. I realized that accepting this dynamic would mean spending the next 18 years watching James continue to grow and achieve, while I remained static in a role that he viewed as noble but ultimately secondary to his more important work in the business world. More significantly, it would mean modeling for Isabella a relationship structure where women's aspirations were considered optional, while men's ambitions were treated as essential family priorities. The morning after our conversation about the conference, I called Catherine Morrison's law office and scheduled a consultation appointment. Catherine had been recommended by Jennifer, who had worked with her during her divorce proceedings 2 years earlier, and had praised both her legal expertise and her understanding of the particular challenges faced by professional women seeking to maintain career development while ensuring appropriate custody arrangements for their children. Catherine Morrison's office was located in a restored Victorian building in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, and the environment immediately conveyed both professionalism and warmth. The reception area featured comfortable seating arrangements and artwork that created an atmosphere of calm confidence rather than the sterile intimidation often associated with legal offices. Catherine herself was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and intelligent hazel eyes that conveyed both compassion and determined competence. She had built her practice specifically around family law cases involving professional women, and her approach emphasized strategic planning and thorough preparation rather than adversarial confrontation whenever possible. During our initial consultation, Catherine listened carefully as I described the pattern of emotional neglect and practical abandonment that had characterized my marriage, paying particular attention to the incident during Isabella's birth and James's subsequent behavior during the early weeks of her life. She took detailed notes about our financial arrangements, property ownership, and James's income and assets, while asking perceptive questions about my own career goals and financial resources. Catherine's questions helped clarify aspects of my situation that I had not fully considered, particularly regarding the legal and practical implications of seeking primary custody of Isabella while maintaining my professional practice. She explained that Illinois family law emphasized the best interests of the child in custody determinations, and that demonstrated patterns of parental involvement and commitment would be significant factors in any custody evaluation. The documentation I had been casually maintaining about James's minimal participation in Isabella's daily care would become crucial evidence in establishing that I had been functioning as her primary caregiver from birth. Catherine advised me to continue recording specific instances of his absence from important events and his lack of engagement with routine childcare responsibilities, as this information would support my request for primary physical custody. More importantly, Catherine helped me understand that seeking divorce did not require me to justify my decision through dramatic accusations or evidence of severe misconduct. The concept of irreconcilable differences provided legal grounds for dissolution without requiring proof of fault, and my dissatisfaction with the fundamental dynamics of our marriage constituted sufficient reason for seeking to end the relationship. This information was particularly liberating because I had been struggling with concerns about whether James's behavior was bad enough to justify divorce, especially given his financial contributions and the absence of obvious abuse or infidelity. Catherine explained that emotional neglect and incompatible values regarding partnership and family priorities were legitimate reasons for concluding that a marriage was no longer viable. Catherine also addressed my concerns about the potential impact of divorce proceedings on Isabella's emotional well-being and future relationship with her father. She emphasized that well-managed divorce processes could actually benefit children by reducing household tension and modeling healthy boundaries and self-respect for mothers, while appropriate custody arrangements could preserve important relationships while ensuring stability and consistency in the child's primary residence. Her approach to custody planning focused on creating arrangements that would serve Isabella's developmental needs, while recognizing both parents' rights and responsibilities. Catherine explained that seeking primary physical custody did not mean eliminating James from Isabella's life, but rather establishing a living arrangement that provided her with stability and consistency, while ensuring that both parents remained meaningfully involved in her upbringing. The financial aspects of divorce planning required careful consideration of both immediate needs and long-term security. Catherine reviewed our joint assets, including our house, investment accounts, and James's business interests, explaining how Illinois property division laws would likely affect the distribution of marital assets. She also discussed spousal support calculations based on the length of our marriage, the disparity in our incomes, and my potential earning capacity in my field of educational psychology. While James earned significantly more than I did through his commercial real estate work, my advanced degree and professional experience would enable me to achieve financial independence with appropriate transitional support. Catherine's analysis revealed that my financial situation post-divorce would be significantly different from my current lifestyle but entirely manageable with proper planning and preparation. The key would be establishing realistic budgets for housing, childcare, and professional expenses, while building my consulting practice to provide stable long-term income. Most importantly, Catherine helped me understand that financial considerations, while important, should not prevent me from pursuing a divorce if I was genuinely unhappy in my marriage and believed that ending the relationship would ultimately benefit both Isabella and me. She had worked with many professional women who had successfully rebuilt their lives after divorce, often discovering greater satisfaction and fulfillment than they had experienced during marriages that had constrained their personal and professional development. Our consultation concluded with Catherine providing me with a detailed action plan for preparing for divorce proceedings while maintaining confidentiality and minimizing disruption to Isabella's routine. The plan included steps for documenting financial information, establishing separate banking arrangements, securing important personal documents, and beginning to develop the evidence that would support my custody and support requests. Catherine also recommended a family therapist who specialized in helping parents navigate divorce proceedings in ways that prioritized children's emotional well-being, and she provided resources for support groups where I could connect with other women who had successfully managed similar transitions. The most significant aspect of our meeting was Catherine's consistent emphasis on my strength and competence throughout the discussion. Rather than positioning me as a victim who needed to be rescued from a difficult marriage, She treated me as a capable professional who was making informed decisions about her future based on realistic assessments of her situation and priorities. Her confidence in my ability to manage the practical and emotional challenges of divorce while continuing to provide excellent care for Isabella reinforced my own growing recognition that I possessed resources and capabilities that I had been underestimating during my marriage. The woman who had felt overwhelmed by the prospect of caring for Isabella alone was actually quite competent at managing multiple responsibilities and making complex decisions under pressure. Following my consultation with Catherine, I began implementing her recommendations with systematic thoroughness. I gathered financial documents including tax returns, bank statements, investment account records, and information about James's business income and assets. I researched childcare options and preschool programs that would support my ability to maintain professional commitments while ensuring high-quality care for Isabella. I also began the delicate process of rebuilding professional connections that had been neglected during my marriage, reaching out to colleagues and former clients who might provide referrals or collaboration opportunities as I prepared to expand my consulting practice. These conversations reminded me of the respect and recognition I had earned in my field before marriage had gradually shifted my focus away from professional development. The response from my professional network was overwhelmingly positive and supportive. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who directed a learning center for children with special needs, immediately expressed interest in contracting with me for psychological evaluations and family consultations. Professor David Chen, who had been my thesis advisor in graduate school, mentioned several research projects that could benefit from my expertise in educational psychology. Most encouraging was the conversation with Dr. Sarah Kim, who had started her own practice in child and family therapy after her own divorce 5 years earlier. Sarah had successfully built a thriving practice while raising 2 young children as a single mother, and she offered both professional collaboration opportunities and personal mentorship as I prepared for my own transition to independence. These professional conversations reinforced my understanding that ending my marriage would not mean sacrificing my career development or financial security. Instead, it would provide opportunities to pursue professional goals that had been constrained by James's expectations and the emotional energy I had been expending on managing a relationship that consistently undervalued my contributions and capabilities. The most transformative aspect of this preparation period was recognizing that I was not leaving my marriage from a position of weakness or desperation, but from a position of growing strength and clear vision about the future I wanted to create for Isabella and myself. I was not fleeing from James's neglect and dismissal, but moving toward a life where my needs and priorities would be respected and valued. Catherine had helped me understand that successful divorce proceedings required strategic thinking and careful preparation, rather than emotional reactivity or impulsive decision-making. The foundation I was building during these weeks of planning would determine not just the legal outcomes of the divorce, but my ability to establish independence and stability for the new life Isabella and I would build together. James remained completely unaware of my consultation with Catherine or the systematic preparation I was undertaking for our separation. His assumption that I was too dependent on his financial support and too overwhelmed by motherhood to consider major life changes had made him complacent about the impact of his continued neglect and dismissal of my needs. He had no idea that the woman he had abandoned during labor and continued to treat as a supporting character in his successful life had developed both the legal strategy and personal determination necessary to create a future where she and their daughter would be valued and respected as the priorities they deserved to be. The weeks following my consultation with Catherine Morrison required a delicate balance of strategic preparation and careful discretion. While James remained focused on his expanding business ventures and oblivious to the fundamental shifts occurring in our household dynamics, I began implementing the systematic plan that would secure Isabella's future and establish the foundation for our independence. The first phase of my preparation involved establishing financial autonomy while maintaining the appearance of normal household management. Catherine had emphasized that creating separate financial resources would be crucial for both practical independence and legal positioning, but this process required careful execution to avoid arousing James's suspicion before I was ready to initiate formal proceedings. I opened a business checking account under the name of my educational consulting practice, using my maiden name and professional credentials to establish the account independently. This decision represented more than just financial planning. It marked my conscious reclamation of an identity that had existed before marriage and would continue after divorce. Elena Castellanos, educational psychology consultant, was not dependent on James Whitmore's approval or financial support for her professional existence and success. The account was established at a different bank from our joint finances, ensuring complete privacy for transactions while providing a secure repository for the funds I was gradually accumulating through increased consulting work and careful budgeting of household expenses. I began accepting additional evaluation contracts and expanding my client base, activities that James viewed as harmless professional engagement rather than recognizing them as strategic preparation for economic independence. My renewed focus on professional development yielded unexpected benefits beyond financial preparation. Dr. Maria Gonzalez's Learning Center proved to be an excellent source of referrals, and my work with families navigating educational challenges provided both income and deep satisfaction that had been missing during the months when my identity had been consumed by domestic responsibilities. Each successful case reinforced my confidence in my professional capabilities and reminded me of the meaningful work I could accomplish when my energy was focused on helping children and families rather than managing James's expectations and accommodating his priorities. The contrast between the gratitude and respect I received from clients and the dismissive treatment I experienced at home became increasingly stark and unacceptable. One particularly rewarding case involved working with 7-year-old Marcus Thompson, whose learning disabilities had been misdiagnosed as behavioral problems by his school district. Through comprehensive evaluation and strategic advocacy, I was able to help his parents secure appropriate educational accommodations that transformed his academic experience and restored his confidence as a learner. Marcus's mother, Dr. Linda Thompson, was a single parent who had successfully built a pediatric practice while raising her son independently. Her combination of professional success and dedicated parenting provided a compelling example of the life I was preparing to create for Isabella and myself. Linda's strength and competence demonstrated that single motherhood, while challenging, could provide children with stability and positive role modeling when managed with intention and commitment. The professional relationships I was developing also created a support network that would be invaluable during the transition period ahead. Dr. Sarah Kim continued to offer both collaboration opportunities and personal guidance based on her own experience navigating divorce while maintaining her clinical practice. Her insights about managing the emotional challenges of separation while protecting children's well-being proved particularly valuable as I prepared for the difficult conversations and decisions that lay ahead. The second phase of my preparation involved documenting the patterns of James's minimal engagement with Isabella's care and his consistent prioritization of business obligations over family responsibilities. Catherine had explained that establishing my role as Isabella's primary caregiver would be crucial for custody determinations, requiring detailed evidence of daily caregiving patterns rather than relying on general assertions about parental involvement. I began maintaining a detailed log of Isabella's daily routines, medical appointments, developmental milestones, and social activities, noting which parent was present for each significant event and who was responsible for routine care tasks. The documentation revealed patterns that were even more pronounced than I had realized during the daily experience of managing them. James had missed Isabella's 4-month pediatric appointment due to a client lunch that could not be rescheduled. He had been absent from her first successful attempts at rolling over because he was working late on contract negotiations. He had never attended any of the new parent support group meetings that I had found valuable for connecting with other families and learning about infant development. Most significantly, James had never independently managed Isabella's care for more than 2 hours at a time, and even those brief periods typically occurred when I was running essential errands rather than pursuing personal or professional activities. His contributions to her daily care remained sporadic and reluctant, offered as assistance to me rather than as natural expressions of paternal responsibility and affection. The documentation process also revealed the extent to which I had unconsciously organized our household routines around James's preferences and schedule, ensuring that Isabella's needs were met without creating inconvenience or disruption for his work commitments. This pattern had developed so gradually that I had not recognized how completely I had assumed responsibility for all aspects of childcare and household management, while James remained focused primarily on his business interests. The third phase of preparation involved securing important documents and creating contingency plans for the practical aspects of separation. Catherine had provided a comprehensive checklist of financial records, legal documents, and personal items that should be safely accessible before initiating divorce proceedings, emphasizing the importance of thorough preparation to avoid complications or conflicts during the formal process. I systematically gathered copies of tax returns, bank statements, investment account records, insurance policies, and property deeds, storing them in a safety deposit box that James was unaware of. I also secured Isabella's birth certificate, social security card, and medical records, ensuring that I would have immediate access to all documents necessary for establishing independent residence and continuing her health care. The process of collecting these documents provided sobering insights into the extent of our joint financial obligations and assets. While James's income was substantial, our lifestyle had expanded to match his earnings, creating ongoing expenses for the mortgage on our Lincoln Park townhouse, luxury car payments, country club memberships, and other status-related expenditures that reflected his priorities rather than practical necessities. Catherine's analysis of our financial situation had prepared me for the reality that divorce would require significant lifestyle adjustments, but reviewing the actual numbers reinforced the importance of establishing realistic expectations and budgets for post-divorce living arrangements. The elegant townhouse and affluent neighborhood that had symbolized James's professional success would need to be replaced with more modest accommodations that I could afford independently. Rather than viewing these changes as losses or sacrifices, I began to see them as opportunities to create a home environment that reflected my own values and priorities, rather than serving as a showcase for James's business achievements. Isabella would benefit more from living in a warm, nurturing environment where she was genuinely valued than from residing in an expensive house where family relationships were secondary to professional obligations. During this preparation period, James's behavior continued to reinforce my decision to pursue divorce, rather than attempting further efforts at marriage counseling or relationship repair. His response to Isabella's developmental milestones remained detached and perfunctory, showing more interest in sharing photos with business associates than in engaging with her growing personality and emerging abilities. When Isabella began showing clear preferences for certain toys and activities, James dismissed these developments as typical infant behavior that did not require particular attention or response. When she started sleeping through the night consistently, he viewed this change primarily as an improvement in household efficiency, rather than recognizing it as evidence of her healthy development and adjustment to routine. Most tellingly, James showed no curiosity about my expanding professional activities or interest in discussing my work with new clients and challenging cases. He continued to view my consulting practice as a pleasant hobby that provided me with intellectual stimulation, while remaining entirely secondary to his more important business responsibilities. His lack of engagement with my professional development was particularly striking, given that my work directly related to child development and family dynamics, areas that should have been of intense interest to a new father concerned about providing the best possible environment for his daughter's growth and well-being. The fourth phase of my preparation involved developing specific plans for post-divorce housing and childcare arrangements that would support both Isabella's stability and my professional requirements. Catherine had emphasized that successful custody arrangements required demonstrating clear ability to provide appropriate care and living conditions, making these practical preparations essential components of the legal strategy. I began researching neighborhoods that would offer good schools, safe environments, and reasonable commuting distances to my primary client locations, focusing on areas that would provide Isabella with community connections and developmental opportunities while remaining within my projected budget constraints. The process required careful balance between affordability and quality, ensuring that our new home would represent improvement in emotional environment, even if it was less impressive in material terms. Childcare planning proved particularly complex, requiring coordination between my irregular consulting schedule and Isabella's need for consistent, high-quality care. I investigated several daycare centers and interviewed potential nannies, who could provide flexible arrangements that would accommodate both routine care and occasional evening or weekend work commitments. The childcare research process introduced me to other working mothers who were successfully managing professional responsibilities while providing excellent care for their children, often as single parents who had created supportive networks and efficient systems for balancing multiple demands. These conversations provided both practical guidance and emotional encouragement for the transition I was preparing to make. Perhaps most importantly, the preparation period allowed me to observe Isabella's responses to different caregivers and environments, helping me understand her personality and preferences in ways that would inform future decisions about her care and development. She showed remarkable adaptability and social engagement, qualities that suggested she would thrive in appropriate daycare settings, while benefiting from the increased attention and consistency that would result from having a more present and engaged primary parent. The most challenging aspect of this preparation period was maintaining normal household routines and relationship dynamics, while internally preparing for such fundamental changes. James's continued obliviousness to my growing independence and determination made it possible to implement my plans without confrontation. But it also highlighted the extent to which he had never truly paid attention to my thoughts, feelings, or activities. His assumption that I was content with our current arrangements and grateful for his financial support had made him complacent about the impact of his neglect and dismissal on my satisfaction with our marriage. He genuinely believed that providing material security was sufficient to maintain my commitment to the relationship, regardless of the absence of emotional connection or genuine partnership. This complacency worked to my advantage during the preparation phase, allowing me to establish financial resources, professional connections, and practical arrangements without interference or opposition. However, it also confirmed that James viewed me as a supporting character in his life story rather than as an individual with her own needs, goals, and capacity for independent decision-making. The woman who had spent years accommodating his priorities and accepting his minimal engagement was transforming into someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to create a life that reflected that understanding. The systematic preparation I was undertaking represented not just practical planning for divorce, but a fundamental reclamation of agency and self-determination that had been gradually eroded during our marriage. By the end of this preparation period, I had established the financial, professional, and emotional foundation necessary to pursue independence with confidence, rather than desperation. I had documented the patterns of James's minimal involvement with Isabella's care and his consistent prioritization of business interests over family responsibilities. I had created contingency plans for housing, childcare, and professional development that would ensure stability during the transition period. Most importantly, I had discovered that I possessed the competence and resilience necessary to build a successful life for Isabella and myself without relying on James's support or approval. The woman who had once believed she needed his presence and guidance to function effectively had proven to herself that she was capable of managing complex responsibilities and making sound decisions independently. James remained unaware that his continued neglect and dismissal had catalyzed such fundamental changes in my perspective and plans. He assumed that my increased professional activity and growing confidence were natural developments that posed no threat to our established relationship dynamics. His failure to recognize the significance of these changes would soon prove to be a critical miscalculation about the woman he had consistently underestimated, and the consequences of taking her commitment for granted. The catalyst for my final decision to proceed with divorce proceedings came during Isabella's 6-month milestone, an event that should have been a celebration of our daughter's healthy development and our growth as a family. Instead, it became the definitive moment when James's fundamental inability to prioritize family relationships over business interests could no longer be rationalized or excused. Dr. Patricia Wells, Isabella's pediatrician, had scheduled her 6-month wellness visit for a Tuesday morning appointment that had been confirmed weeks in advance. This appointment was particularly significant because it would include comprehensive developmental assessments, important vaccinations, and discussions about beginning solid foods and establishing sleep routines that would affect our entire family's daily schedule. I had specifically arranged the appointment for a time when James typically had fewer scheduling conflicts, and I had reminded him multiple times about the importance of both parents being present for this milestone evaluation. Dr. Wells had emphasized during previous visits that parental input from both caregivers provided valuable perspectives on infant development and helped ensure that any concerns or questions could be addressed comprehensively. James had confirmed his attendance at the appointment during our conversation the previous weekend, acknowledging that Isabella's 6-month checkup represented an important milestone and expressing appropriate interest in hearing about her developmental progress. His apparent commitment to participating in this significant moment had provided me with cautious optimism that fatherhood might finally be catalyzing some positive changes in his priority system. On the morning of the appointment, I prepared Isabella carefully for the visit, ensuring that she was well-fed and alert for the developmental assessments while organizing her medical records and preparing questions about her feeding schedule and sleep patterns. I had documented her recent achievements, including her success at sitting independently and her growing interest in different textures and toys, information that would help Dr. Wells evaluate her progress against standard developmental milestones. James left for the office that morning with assurances that he would meet us at Dr. Wells' office at the scheduled appointment time. His departure seemed routine and unremarkable, and I had no reason to anticipate that this day would become another defining moment in my understanding of his character and priorities. Isabella and I arrived at the pediatric office 15 minutes early, allowing time for routine check-in procedures and ensuring that we would be ready when Dr. Wells was available to begin the comprehensive evaluation. I spent the waiting time reviewing my notes about Isabella's recent development and observing her interactions with the toys and books available in the pediatric waiting area. When our appointment time arrived and James had not appeared, I initially assumed he was encountering typical downtown traffic delays or had been detained by an unexpected phone call. Dr. Wells' staff was accommodating about starting the appointment a few minutes late, understanding that coordinating schedules for busy parents could present logistical challenges. As the delay extended beyond 15 minutes, I called James's cell phone and received an immediate transfer to voicemail, suggesting that he was either in a meeting or deliberately avoiding calls. I left a brief message reminding him about the appointment and asking him to call back with an updated arrival time, still hoping that his absence was due to unavoidable circumstances rather than conscious prioritization of other commitments. Dr. Wells eventually suggested that we proceed with the appointment rather than continuing to delay Isabella's care, though she expressed disappointment that James would miss the developmental discussions and educational information that were integral parts of the 6-month visit. Her professional demeanor remained supportive and understanding, but I detected subtle concern about the pattern of James's absence from important medical appointments. The appointment proceeded smoothly despite James's absence, with Dr. Wells conducting thorough evaluations of Isabella's physical development, motor skills, and social responsiveness. Isabella performed beautifully during all assessments, demonstrating advanced development in several areas and showing the kind of engaged, alert personality that indicated excellent care and attention from her primary caregiver. Dr. Wells complimented my detailed observations about Isabella's daily routines and developmental progress, noting that my background in educational psychology provided valuable insights into her cognitive and social development. She emphasized that Isabella's excellent health and development reflected consistent, attentive caregiving and a nurturing environment that was supporting her growth optimally. During our discussion about introducing solid foods and establishing more structured sleep schedules, Dr. Wells asked several questions that assumed both parents would be involved in implementing the recommended changes. When I explained that James's work schedule made him unavailable for most daily routines, she tactfully adjusted her recommendations to focus on strategies I could manage independently, while expressing hope that he would become more involved as Isabella grew older. The conversation revealed how completely I had internalized the assumption that I would be solely responsible for implementing medical recommendations and managing Isabella's daily care, despite being married to someone who should theoretically share these responsibilities. Dr. Wells' questions made me realize that single parents typically received more comprehensive support and resources than I was accessing, because healthcare providers recognized their need for additional assistance, rather than assuming they had reliable partners who were simply absent temporarily. James finally called during our drive home from the appointment, offering brief apologies about an unexpected client emergency that had required his immediate attention and prevented him from attending Isabella's checkup. His explanation followed the familiar pattern of presenting business obligations as unavoidable crises, while characterizing family commitments as flexible appointments that could be rescheduled without significant consequences. When I attempted to share Dr. Wells' recommendations about Isabella's feeding and sleep routines, James listened with distracted attention before suggesting that I handle the implementation since I was more familiar with her daily schedule anyway. His response demonstrated that he viewed parenting as primarily my responsibility, with his involvement being helpful but not essential for making important decisions about our daughter's care and development. Most significantly, James showed no genuine remorse about missing this important milestone or curiosity about what he had missed during the comprehensive evaluation. His focus remained on justifying his absence, rather than understanding its impact on Isabella's care, or my experience of managing significant parenting responsibilities without support from my supposed partner. That evening, as I reviewed Dr. Wells' written recommendations and began planning changes to Isabella's feeding schedule, I realized that James's absence from the appointment was not an isolated incident, but rather a definitive statement about his priorities and his vision of our family dynamics. He had demonstrated once again that business commitments would always take precedence over family responsibilities, regardless of their significance or timing. The pattern that had begun with his abandonment during Isabella's birth had continued through her early months and was now extending to her ongoing medical care and developmental monitoring. James was not going to become more involved or attentive as she grew older. He was going to continue viewing fatherhood as a secondary role that could be managed around his primary focus on professional success. This recognition catalyzed my decision to schedule a final consultation with Catherine Morrison and proceed with filing divorce papers. The systematic preparation I had been conducting over the previous months had created the foundation necessary for independent living, and James's continued demonstration of misplaced priorities had eliminated any remaining doubts about the appropriateness of ending our marriage. During my final consultation with Catherine, I reviewed the comprehensive documentation I had assembled about James's minimal involvement in Isabella's care and his consistent pattern of prioritizing business interests over family responsibilities. The evidence was extensive and compelling, clearly establishing that I had been functioning as Isabella's primary caregiver from birth, while James had remained peripheral to her daily care and development. Catherine reviewed my financial preparations and confirmed that I had successfully established the resources and professional connections necessary to support independent living while maintaining appropriate care for Isabella. My consulting practice had grown sufficiently to provide stable income, and the budget projections for post-divorce expenses were realistic and manageable given my earning potential in educational psychology. Most importantly, Catherine emphasized that my systematic preparation and careful documentation had created optimal conditions for pursuing custody arrangements that would serve Isabella's best interests while protecting her from unnecessary disruption during the transition period. The evidence of James's limited involvement in her care would support requests for primary physical custody while ensuring that he maintained appropriate visitation rights and parental responsibilities. Catherine explained that the divorce papers would be served to James at his office, a professional setting that would minimize potential emotional volatility while ensuring that he received the documents in a context where he would be expected to respond with appropriate composure. The timing of service would be coordinated to allow for orderly transition arrangements while protecting Isabella from exposure to conflict or instability. The legal documents Catherine had prepared were comprehensive and precise, addressing custody arrangements, property division, spousal support, and child support obligations in ways that reflected both Illinois family law requirements and the specific circumstances of our marriage and separation. The paperwork represented not just the formal end of our relationship, but the legal foundation for the independent life I was prepared to build with Isabella. Signing the divorce petition represented a moment of profound transformation that went beyond the legal implications of the document. With my signature, I was formally declaring my recognition of my own worth and my refusal to continue accepting treatment that diminished my value and undermined my well-being. I was choosing to model for Isabella a life where relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than accommodation and compromise. The woman who had spent 8 years making excuses for James's emotional unavailability and who had accepted his abandonment during the most vulnerable moment of her life was officially ending her participation in a dynamic that had consistently prioritized his comfort over her happiness. The systematic preparation and careful planning that had brought me to this moment represented not just practical logistics, but a fundamental reclamation of agency and self-determination. Catherine scheduled the service of papers for the following Thursday, allowing me several days to finalize practical arrangements and prepare emotionally for James's response to discovering that his assumptions about my dependence and passivity had been fundamentally incorrect. She provided detailed guidance about managing the immediate aftermath of service, including strategies for maintaining household stability and protecting Isabella from unnecessary stress during the initial period of adjustment. The days between signing the papers and their service were filled with quiet anticipation and final preparations for the new phase of life that was about to begin. I continued maintaining normal household routines, while internally preparing for the dramatic changes that James's receipt of the divorce petition would initiate in our family dynamics. During this period, I found myself observing James with a mixture of sadness and relief, recognizing both the positive qualities that had initially attracted me to him and the fundamental character limitations that had made our marriage unsustainable. He was not an evil person, but he was someone whose worldview and priorities were incompatible with the kind of partnership and family life that Isabella and I deserved. James's continued obliviousness to the magnitude of change that was about to occur in his life reflected the same lack of attention and awareness that had characterized his approach to our marriage and his relationship with Isabella. His assumption that his minimal effort and financial contributions were sufficient to maintain my commitment to the relationship had made him complacent about the consequences of his continued neglect and dismissal. The irony was that James believed he was being a responsible husband and father by focusing on professional success and financial security, not understanding that his approach was actually undermining the family stability he claimed to be protecting. His inability to recognize the importance of emotional presence and genuine partnership had created the very problems he would soon discover had led to the dissolution of his marriage. On Wednesday evening, as James reviewed business documents and prepared for meetings while I fed Isabella and organized her bedtime routine, I realized that this would be our last evening together as a married couple before everything changed irreversibly. The quiet domesticity of the moment belied the magnitude of transformation that would begin with the service of papers the following afternoon. Isabella, now 6 months old and thriving despite her father's minimal involvement in her daily care, represented both the catalyst for my decision to pursue divorce and the motivation for creating a better life for both of us. Her innocent trust and dependence had awakened my understanding of what it meant to love someone unconditionally and to prioritize their well-being above all other considerations. The woman who had once believed that love required accepting whatever attention and care someone else was willing to provide had discovered through motherhood that real love demanded much more. It required presence, consistency, genuine engagement, and the willingness to make necessary sacrifices for the benefit of those we claimed to cherish most. James had never understood this definition of love, viewing relationships as exchanges where his financial contributions should be sufficient to secure loyalty and commitment regardless of his emotional availability or practical involvement. Tomorrow he would discover that the woman he had consistently underestimated possessed both the strength and determination necessary to reject that transactional approach to marriage and family life. The service of divorce papers would mark not just the legal beginning of our separation, but the moment when James would finally be forced to confront the consequences of years of taking his wife and daughter for granted. His shock and disbelief would reflect not just surprise at my decision, but recognition that he had fundamentally misunderstood both my character and my capacity for independent action. Thursday morning proceeded with deceptive normalcy, as James prepared for his workday with the same methodical routine that had characterized our marriage for 8 years. He reviewed his appointment schedule over coffee, discussed his plans for client meetings during the afternoon, and departed for his downtown office with the casual confidence of someone whose world remained predictably stable and secure. I maintained my typical morning routine with Isabella, preparing her breakfast and engaging in the developmental activities that had become central to our daily schedule. The contrast between the ordinary nature of these familiar tasks and the extraordinary transformation that would occur later that day created a surreal quality to those final hours before everything changed irreversibly. Catherine Morrison had confirmed that the process server would arrive at James's office at precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, a timing that would ensure he received the divorce papers during normal business hours, when he would be expected to maintain professional composure despite the personal shock of the document's contents. The strategic scheduling would also provide me with several hours to prepare for his inevitable phone calls and potential return home before Isabella's evening routine. During the morning hours, I completed final preparations for the conversation that would inevitably follow James's receipt of the divorce petition. I reviewed the key points that Catherine had recommended emphasizing during our initial discussion, focusing on practical arrangements for Isabella's care and the timeline for implementing custody and support agreements, rather than engaging in emotional arguments about the reasons for my decision. Catherine had stressed the importance of maintaining calm, factual communication during this critical period, avoiding defensive explanations or attempts to justify my choices through detailed recounting of James's failures as a husband and father. The divorce papers themselves provided comprehensive legal documentation of our irreconcilable differences, and my role during initial conversations should focus on facilitating orderly transitions rather than relitigating past grievances. I also prepared Isabella's afternoon schedule to ensure that she would be occupied with engaging activities during the time when James would likely be processing the shock of receiving divorce papers and attempting to reach me for explanations and negotiations. Her routine would remain as normal and stable as possible, protecting her from exposure to adult conflicts, while providing me with the structure necessary to manage my own emotional responses to the day's events. The morning passed with unusual swiftness as I focused on routine tasks and practical preparations, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of childcare and household management, while anticipating the moment when our carefully maintained domestic stability would be permanently altered by legal reality. At precisely 1:45 p.m., Catherine called to confirm that the process server was en route to James's office and that service would occur as scheduled. Her brief conversation provided final reassurance that all legal documentation was properly prepared, and that the initial phase of divorce proceedings would be handled with appropriate professionalism and discretion. The 15 minutes between Catherine's call and the scheduled service time felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, marked by heightened awareness of ordinary sounds and sensations as I processed the magnitude of the step I had taken. Isabella played contentedly with her toys, completely unaware that her family structure was about to undergo fundamental transformation that would ultimately provide her with greater stability and more consistent care. At exactly 2:17 p.m., my phone rang with James's office number displayed on the caller identification. The 17-minute delay between the scheduled service time and his call suggested that he had needed time to read through the comprehensive legal documents and process their implications before attempting to contact me for explanations and negotiations. When I answered the call, James's voice carried a combination of shock, confusion, and rising anger that I had anticipated based on Catherine's descriptions of typical responses to divorce paper service. His initial words were barely coherent, reflecting the emotional disruption that occurs when someone's fundamental assumptions about their life circumstances are suddenly revealed to be incorrect. "Elena, what the hell is this? What are these papers? This has to be some kind of mistake," James said, his voice tight with strain and disbelief. "I just had some guy serve me with divorce papers at my office in front of my colleagues. This is insane. You can't be serious about this." His focus on the professional embarrassment of receiving legal documents at his workplace, rather than concern about the dissolution of our marriage, revealed the continuing priority he placed on his business reputation over our family relationships. Even in this moment of personal crisis, James's primary concern was managing the impact on his professional image, rather than understanding why his wife had concluded that their marriage was irreparably damaged. I responded with the calm, factual tone that Catherine had recommended, acknowledging that I had indeed filed for divorce, and that the papers he had received represented the formal beginning of legal proceedings to dissolve our marriage. I explained that I was prepared to discuss practical arrangements for Isabella's care and our separation logistics, but that my decision to end the marriage was final and not subject to negotiation or reversal. James's response revealed the depth of his assumption that I would never take decisive action to change our relationship dynamics without his permission and participation. His shock seemed genuine, suggesting that he had been completely unaware of my months of preparation and planning, despite the clear signs of my growing independence and professional engagement. "Elena, you can't just decide to get divorced without talking to me about it," James said, his voice becoming more agitated as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his initial disbelief. "We're married. We have a child together. We have a house, investments, a life together. You can't just throw all of that away because you're having some kind of postpartum emotional crisis. His characterization of my carefully considered decision as a postpartum emotional crisis demonstrated his fundamental inability to recognize my concerns as legitimate grievances worthy of serious attention. Even confronted with legal documents that clearly articulated irreconcilable differences and requested dissolution of our marriage, James remained convinced that my dissatisfaction was temporary and irrational rather than based on years of accumulated disappointment and neglect. I explained that my decision was not impulsive or emotionally driven, but rather the result of extensive consideration and planning based on our fundamental incompatibility regarding partnership, parenting responsibilities, and family priorities. I emphasized that the divorce papers contained detailed information about custody arrangements and support obligations that had been carefully developed to serve Isabella's best interests while ensuring fair treatment for both parents. James's response to my explanation revealed his complete inability to understand how our marriage had failed from my perspective. Despite years of clear communication about my needs for greater emotional connection and shared parenting responsibilities, his confusion seemed genuine, reflecting not deliberate cruelty but rather profound disconnection from my experience of our relationship. "Elena, I don't understand what you're talking about," James said, his voice carrying frustration and bewilderment. "I've been a good husband. I work hard to provide for our family. I've never cheated on you. I've never been abusive. What more do you want from me? What's this really about?" His definition of adequate husbanding focused exclusively on financial provision and the absence of obvious misconduct, revealing his inability to comprehend that emotional neglect and practical abandonment could be equally damaging to marriage and family relationships. James genuinely believed that meeting basic legal and financial obligations was sufficient to maintain a wife's commitment, regardless of the quality of emotional connection or level of practical partnership. I attempted to explain that successful marriages required more than financial support and legal fidelity, emphasizing the importance of emotional presence, shared parenting responsibilities, and mutual consideration in daily decision-making. I referenced specific examples of his absence during crucial moments, including Isabella's birth and her recent medical appointments, to illustrate the pattern of prioritizing business interests over family needs. James's response to these examples demonstrated his continued inability to recognize the significance of his choices and their impact on our family relationships. He dismissed his absence during Isabella's birth as unavoidable business necessity and characterized his missed medical appointments as unfortunate scheduling conflicts rather than conscious decisions that revealed his priorities. "Elena, you're being completely unreasonable," James said, his tone becoming more defensive and accusatory. "I missed one doctor's appointment because of a client emergency. That doesn't mean I'm a bad father. I work 60 hours a week to pay for this house, your car, Isabella's everything. How can you say I don't care about my family when everything I do is for your benefit?" His inability to understand the difference between providing material support and offering emotional partnership confirmed that continued marriage would mean perpetually accepting a relationship where my needs for connection and genuine collaboration would never be recognized as legitimate or important. James viewed marriage as a transaction where his financial contributions should secure loyalty and gratitude, regardless of his actual presence or engagement with family life. The conversation continued for nearly an hour as James alternated between attempting to convince me that my grievances were exaggerated and threatening consequences if I proceeded with divorce proceedings. He warned that custody disputes would be expensive and emotionally damaging for Isabella, implied that I would struggle financially without his support, and suggested that my reputation in our social circle would suffer from being perceived as someone who abandoned a stable marriage. His threats and warnings revealed his assumption that fear of practical difficulties and social judgment would ultimately override my determination to end our marriage. James believed that I had become too dependent on his financial support and too concerned about social approval to follow through with divorce proceedings, despite having received legal papers that clearly demonstrated my commitment to dissolution. I responded to his concerns with information about the thorough preparation I had completed, including financial planning, professional development, and childcare arrangements that would ensure stability for Isabella and me during the transition period. My calm presentation of these practical preparations seemed to shock James more than the divorce papers themselves, as he realized that my decision was not impulsive, but rather the culmination of months of systematic planning. "You've been planning this for months?" James asked, his voice carrying a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "You've been living in our house, taking care of our daughter, acting like everything was normal while secretly planning to leave me. How could you be so deceptive?" His characterization of my preparation as deception revealed his expectation that I should have continued accepting unsatisfactory treatment while openly discussing my growing dissatisfaction and plans for independence. James seemed to believe that I owed him advance warning before taking steps to protect my own well-being and Isabella's future, despite his consistent dismissal of my previous attempts to address problems in our marriage. I explained that my preparation had been necessary to ensure responsible transition planning rather than impulsive decision-making that could harm Isabella's stability and well-being. I emphasized that my priority throughout the process had been protecting our daughter from unnecessary disruption while creating the foundation for a more stable and nurturing environment for her continued development. James's response to this explanation revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of my motivations and character. He seemed genuinely surprised that I had been capable of sustained planning and decisive action, having apparently believed that I lacked the competence and determination necessary to manage major life changes independently. "I can't believe you're doing this to our family," James said, his voice becoming more emotional as the reality of losing control over the situation became apparent. "Think about what you're doing to Isabella. She needs both her parents together. She needs stability and security, not a broken home because her mother decided she wasn't happy enough with her comfortable life." His appeal to Isabella's well-being as justification for maintaining an unsatisfactory marriage revealed his inability to recognize that children benefit more from seeing healthy relationship dynamics than from living in households where one parent is consistently undervalued and neglected. James believed that the appearance of family stability was more important than the actual quality of relationships within the family structure. I concluded the conversation by reiterating that my decision was final, and that further discussions should focus on practical arrangements for custody, visitation, and property division, rather than attempts to reverse or delay divorce proceedings. I provided Catherine Morrison's contact information and suggested that James consult with his own attorney to ensure appropriate legal representation during the dissolution process. The phone call ended with James expressing continued disbelief and promising to, quote, "fix whatever problems existed in our marriage if I would reconsider my decision." His offer to address unspecified issues demonstrated that he still did not understand the specific patterns of neglect and dismissal that had led to my conclusion that our relationship was irreparably damaged. The hours following our conversation were marked by a series of text messages and voicemails from James as he processed the implications of the divorce papers and attempted various strategies for convincing me to reconsider my decision. His messages alternated between promises of changed behavior, expressions of love and commitment, and warnings about the practical difficulties of single parenthood. The most revealing aspect of James's response was his complete focus on convincing me to change my mind, rather than any genuine curiosity about my experience of our marriage or acknowledgement that his behavior might have contributed to my dissatisfaction. Even confronted with the reality of divorce proceedings, James remained convinced that the problem was my unrealistic expectations rather than his inadequate effort and attention. His inability to engage in meaningful self-reflection or accept responsibility for his role in our marriage's failure confirmed that dissolution was the appropriate choice for Isabella's and my future well-being. James would likely continue believing that he had been an adequate husband and father who had been abandoned by an ungrateful wife, rather than recognizing the opportunities he had missed to create genuine partnership and meaningful family relationships. The woman who had once made excuses for his absence during the birth of their child had evolved into someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept treatment that fell short of her standards for respect and consideration. The systematic preparation and decisive action that had brought us to this moment represented not just the end of an unsatisfactory marriage, but the beginning of a life where Isabella and I would be valued and prioritized, as we deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.